Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
It's good to be back.
We are your guides through the great texts of the theological library. We take these old books, these sermons, the confessions, all from a Protestant Reformed perspective.
Yeah.
And we try to get to the heart of what they're saying.
Mm-hmm. The goal is really to see how these historic ideas can still speak to us right now.
And we have a pretty significant text on the table for this deep dive.
We do. We're looking at a sermon by Jonathan Edwards. And as soon as you say that name, people immediately think of one thing.
Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
Always. The spider dangling over the flame.
Right. It's what he's famous for.
It is. But Edwards was so much more than that. He was a pastor, a brilliant theologian, and he spent his life trying to understand the mechanics of the soul, you could say.
So what's the sermon for today?
It's titled, God Makes Men Sensible of Their Misery Before He Reveals His Mercy and Love.
Okay, that's a mouthful of a title, but it's pretty direct. It lays out the whole argument right there.
It does. And he's preaching from Hosea chapter 5, verse 15. So our mission today is to try and understand a really difficult concept, this idea of humiliation.
Humiliation.
Not the word we love.
Not at all. But for Edwards, it's this necessary process of conviction, of, feeling the real weight of your own sin before you can feel the comfort of the gospel.
It brings up a question I think a lot of people wrestle with. Why does God seem to pull away, to withdraw, right before he saves? And why does it get so much darker right before the dawn?
That is the central question. So let's start where Edwards does. Let's start with the text, Hosea 5.15.
Okay, so the verse reads, I will go and return to my place till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face. In their affliction, they will seek me early.
The first thing that jumps out is that phrase, I will go and return to my place.
Yeah, that sounds like abandonment, like God is just leaving.
It feels that way. But to get it, you have to look at the verses just before it. Edwards points out that Hosea is talking to both Ephraim, that's the 10 tribes of Israel, and to Judah, the 2 southern tribes.
And in the lead-up, God uses some pretty terrifying imagery to describe himself. He's not a gentle shepherd here.
No, he says God is a lion.
A lion, and a young lion. He says, I will be unto Ephraim as a lion, and as a young lion to the house of Judah. Even I, will tear and go away.
I will tear. That is incredibly violent language.
It's shocking. But the second part of that is just as critical for Edwards' sermon, and go away. That's the key.
He doesn't just tear, he tears and leaves.
Right. The lion inflicts this terrible wound, and then instead of immediately healing it, he withdraws. He returns to his place, leaving the sinner in that torn, afflicted condition.
And Edwards' argument is that this isn't random cruelty. There's a purpose behind the withdrawal.
A very specific purpose. It's a waiting game. He says he'll wait till they acknowledge their offense. And Edwards breaks this down into 3 conditions that God is waiting for them to meet.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, they have to be sensible of their guilt. He points out that the original Hebrew is interesting here. It literally means something like, till they become guilty.
Wait, but aren't they already guilty? I mean, God is tearing them like a lion. The crime has already happened.
They're objectively guilty, yes. But the nuance, as Edwards sees it, is till they become guilty in their own eyes. It's one thing to have broken the law. It's another thing entirely to finally see yourself as a criminal. It's about that internal recognition.
So it's a felt guilt, an owned guilt.
Exactly. So that's condition 1. Condition 2 is sensibility of their misery.
Okay.
The text says, in their affliction they will seek me. Before the lion tore them, they were proud, they were going their own way, they didn't feel any real need for God.
But now they're hurting.
Now they're hurting, they're feeling the consequences. The affliction is making them aware of their miserable state.
And what's the third condition?
The third is sensibility of need, or you could say helplessness. The verse says they will seek him early.
And early here doesn't mean first thing in the morning.
No, it implies with earnestness, with urgency. Edwards points out that earlier in Hosea, when Ephraim sought his sickness, what did he do? He ran to the Assyrian king for help.
He looked for a political fix, an alliance.
He looked to King Jareb, another name used for the Assyrian king. He tried every human solution he could think of. But those earthly powers couldn't heal a wound that God himself had made.
Because if the lion is the one who tore you, a human king can't provide the stitches.
That's it. So God withdraws to let all those other options fail. He waits until they finally realize, the Assyrian can't save me. My own strength can't save me. The only one who can heal this wound is the one who made it.
This really sets up the main point, the core doctrine of the whole sermon.
It does. Edwards states it very plainly. It is God's manner to make men sensible of their misery and unworthiness before he appears in his mercy.
And he says this applies to everything, right? Not just salvation.
Right. He clarifies that it applies to big temporal deliverances, like saving a nation from an enemy or a person from a grave sickness. But most of all, it applies to spiritual salvation. He sees it as a fundamental pattern of providence.
And this is where Edwards is, I think, at his best. He doesn't just give you the thesis statement. He then takes you on a tour through the whole Old Testament to prove it.
He really does. He starts with Joseph, a perfect example. Before Joseph is raised up to be second in command in all of Egypt, this picture of glory and deliverance, where do we find him?
In a dungeon, in the pit, falsely accused, totally forgotten.
He has to be completely humbled, brought to the absolute bottom before he can be exalted.
Then Edwards flips the camera, so to speak, over to Joseph's brothers.
Yes, they come to Egypt desperate for food. And Joseph recognizes them, but he doesn't just say, hey, it's me.
No, not at all. He puts them through the ringer. He accuses them of being spies, throws them in jail.
He demands they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, which he knows will terrify their father. From the outside, it looks unbelievably harsh.
It seems cruel.
But Edwards says it was necessary. They had to go through that anxiety, that distress, that fear of losing everything. They had to be brought to the point where they finally confessed to each other. We are verily guilty concerning our brother.
They had to feel the weight of their old sin.
Only then, when they were at the absolute end of their rope, convinced they were about to lose Benjamin and be destroyed, only then did Joseph reveal himself. And the joy of that reunion was made so much greater because of the agony that came before it.
He even brings up their father, Jacob.
Yes, back in Canaan, Jacob is in despair. He cries out, all these things are against me. He's convinced Joseph is dead. Simeon is now a prisoner in Egypt. And now these men want to take Benjamin. It's the lowest point of his life.
He thinks God has abandoned him completely.
And it's right at that moment of total darkness that the wagons arrive with the news that Joseph is alive and is the ruler of Egypt.
The contrast is what makes the deliverance so stunning. The darkness makes the light so much brighter.
It's a dramatic tension. And he sees the same pattern with the Exodus. You'd think if God is going to perform his greatest act of Old Testament salvation, he'd just, snap his fingers and make it easy.
Yeah.
But what happens right before they're delivered?
Things get way worse. Pharaoh takes away their straw for making bricks, but demands the same quota. Their slavery becomes unbearable.
The bondage had to become extreme, as Edwards puts it. And even after they leave Egypt, where does God lead them?
Straight into a trap.
Right, to the shore of the Red Sea. The sea's in front of them, mountains on the sides, and Pharaoh's entire army is closing in from behind. They are shut up on all sides. They're terrified. They're screaming at Moses that he brought them out there to die.
And it's at that moment of maximum terror and helplessness.
That's when the waters part. It's the pattern again and again. Distress comes before glory.
And then, of course, you have the wilderness. I mean, if there was ever a 40-year-long lesson in this, that's it.
Oh, absolutely. Edwards leans heavily on Deuteronomy here, chapters 8 and 32. He quotes that phrase, God led them through a waste-howling wilderness. He didn't take them the easy way, the short route through the Philistine country.
He took them the long way around for 40 years.
And Scripture is crystal clear about why. It says it was to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart.
That phrase is so interesting, to know what was in thine heart. But of course, God already knows everything.
Right, and that's the key. God knew what was in their hearts, but they didn't. They thought they were pretty decent people.
They needed to see it for themselves.
The trials were designed to expose what was really there. The hunger, the thirst, the fiery serpents. Edwards brings up the manna. God let them get desperately hungry before he provided the bread from heaven. Why? To teach them that man does not live by bread alone.
So the suffering was a kind of divine classroom.
It was an education in their own perverseness, in their own dependence. If they had just marched into Canaan after a few weeks, they would have been tempted to say, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth.
We did this because we're so righteous.
Exactly. The wilderness journey was designed to crush that self-righteousness completely, so they would know that the land was a gift of grace, not a wage they had earned.
And this pattern, it doesn't just stop with the Old Testament. He carries it right into the New.
He does. He brings up the story of the woman of Canaan.
That's a really tough story to read. She comes to Jesus begging for healing for her daughter, and at first, he just ignores her.
Complete silence. And then, when the disciples complain and he finally does speak to her, it's what Edwards calls a humbling answer.
He says, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs."
I mean, can you imagine being called a dog by the Son of God? Most of us would have just slunk away in shame or gotten angry.
But she doesn't.
No. Look at her response. She accepts the status. She basically says, yes, Lord, I am a dog. But even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. It's her total acceptance of her own unworthiness, her humiliation, that precedes Jesus saying, "O woman, great is thy faith."
It's the same pattern as the prodigal son, isn't it? He had to end up in a pigsty, so hungry he was willing to eat pig food before he finally came to himself and went home.
Perfect parallel. And Edwards even quotes Paul in 2 Corinthians, who talks about having the sentence of death in himself, so that he would learn not to trust in himself but in God who raises the dead. The pattern is just woven through the entire Bible.
Okay, so he's established this historical pattern. Let's move into part 2 of the sermon, where he gets very psychological. He calls it the anatomy of conversion. He wants to look inside the soul and see how God actually does this work. How does God reveal this misery to a person?
Right. He moves from the big picture of history to the internal experience of a single soul. And he breaks it down into 4 distinct steps or convictions that a person goes through.
So what's step 1?
Step 1 is the conviction of sin or guilt. This is where you first become aware that you have a real problem.
So it's more than just a vague feeling of, I'm not perfect.
Much more. Edwards says God sets their sins in order before their eyes. It's like a specific, detailed accounting. Sins you committed years ago and completely forgot about, things you dismissed at the time as light offenses, suddenly come rushing back to your memory with incredible weight.
He uses that phrase, the specter of sin, like these past actions are literally haunting you.
They haunt the memory, yes. And Edwards says God uses 2 main methods to reveal the corruption of the heart during this stage. The first is obvious. You look at your life, at all your sinful actions, and you realize they must come from a polluted source, a fountain of corruption inside you.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second method?
The second one is fascinating and, frankly, a bit scary. He says God sometimes allows the heart's true nature to show itself while it's under the terror of conviction.
Let's unpack that. What does that mean?
So imagine a person is terrified of hell. They're under immense spiritual stress. You would think their natural reaction would be to become pious and humble. But instead, their heart reacts with anger and resentment towards God.
Wow.
They start murmuring against God, just like the Israelites did in the wilderness. They feel that his law is too strict, that his judgment is unfair. And Edwards says God allows this ugly reaction to surface so the sinner can see it and be horrified by it, so they can say, my goodness, I am truly wicked. Even when I'm terrified of judgment, my first instinct is to hate the judge.
It exposes what he calls the plague of their own hearts.
Precisely. It's not to excuse that sinful reaction, but to use it as a diagnostic tool to show the sinner that their nature is rotten all the way to the core.
So that's step 1, conviction of guilt. What's step 2?
Step 2 is the conviction of danger or misery. This is where you move from I did wrong things to I am in serious, serious trouble because of them.
It's the difference between seeing a no trespassing sign and hearing the shotgun cock behind you.
That's a good way to put it. It's about feeling the personal danger. And this is where Edwards' reputation comes from, his ability to make this real for people.
He makes it visceral.
He talks about the dreadfulness of God's wrath. It's moving from just hearing about God's anger in a sermon to feeling the terrifying reality of what it means to fall into the hands of the living God. He says this conviction often works on the imagination. Sinners feel as if they can already see the flames of hell or hear the shrieks of the damned.
That's the classic, intense Edwards.
It is. But it's important to see the connection he's making. It's not just a generic fear of fire. The key is seeing the direct link between your specific guilt and that specific wrath. It's the dawning realization that my sin, the things I have done, has earned me this. I forged the very chains that are now binding me.
Like Adam and Eve hiding in the garden after they ate the fruit. They weren't just hiding, they were terrified because they knew what they had done and who was coming to find them.
Exactly. Or the Philippian jailer who falls down trembling before Paul and Silas. Or even Elijah, remember, before God speaks in the still, small voice, there's the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. The terror often comes before the comfort.
Okay, so we've got guilt and danger. Step 3 seems like the hardest one for modern people to accept. The conviction of desert. The idea that you actually deserve the punishment.
This is absolutely critical for Edwards' whole system. He would say that many, many people are afraid of hell. Very few people truly believe they belong there.
Our natural instinct is to say, okay, I'm not perfect, I've made some mistakes, but eternal punishment, that seems excessive, disproportionate.
And as long as you are thinking that, you are still arguing with God. You're putting God in the dock and judging him. Edwards says the sinner's mouth must be stopped, and he's quoting Romans 3:19 there. You have to get to a point where all your arguments, all your excuses, all your self-justification just crumble, and you are left with the plain admission that God would be perfectly and completely just to condemn you forever.
How on earth does a person get to that point? It goes against every instinct for self-preservation.
It does. Edwards explains the mechanics of it through what he calls natural conscience. He argues that even though humanity is fallen, we weren't left without a conscience. Our reason is impaired, but the conscience still works. And it does two things. One, it distinguishes right from wrong. And two, it automatically suggests a connection between doing wrong and deserving punishment.
So deep down, there's a part of us that knows.
There is, but sin stupefies it, as he says. It numbs it, buries it under layers of excuses. So Edwards says, the Holy Spirit comes to assist the natural conscience. The Spirit doesn't give you a new conscience. He turns the light on so your existing conscience can work properly.
And how does he do that?
He uses the law. He brings the thunders of Mount Sinai into the courtroom of your soul. The Spirit's work is to show you the awful greatness, the infinite majesty of the God you have offended.
So the logic is the greater the person you offend, the greater the crime.
That's it exactly. If you insult a stranger, it's one thing. If you insult a king, it's a much more serious offense. If you sin against a God of infinite greatness, infinite holiness, and infinite majesty, well, that deserves an infinite punishment. When the Spirit illuminates the sheer reality of who God is, even a natural, unregenerate person can be brought to see the perfect justice of their own condemnation.
So they stop fighting, they stop saying, it's not fair, and they finally just say, I am guilty.
Yes, they stand guilty before God. Their mouth is stopped. There's nothing left to say.
Which has to lead directly to step 4, the conviction of helplessness. Because if I know I'm guilty, I'm in danger, and I deserve it. My very next thought is going to be, what can I do to fix this?
That's the last stand of human pride. Okay, I'll do better. I'll pray more. I'll read my Bible. I'll turn over a new leaf. I'll clean up my act. Edwards has a great phrase for this. He calls it building castles in the air.
That's a perfect image for it.
We try to reform ourselves, to mend our own hearts by our own strength. But God has to shatter this final illusion too. So he lets the sinner try. He lets them strive and struggle to make themselves better. And what happened?
They fail, utterly.
They fail spectacularly. They try to make their heart love God, but all they find is coldness and enmity. They try to stop a particular sin, and it seems to flare up with even more power than before. The more they try to get better, the worse they feel their own heart becoming.
It's like being stuck in quicksand. The more you struggle, the faster you sink.
That is precisely the point. God, in his mercy, shuts them up. Edwards quotes Galatians 3, which talks about the law keeping us shut up unto the faith. It's like being in a prison with no exit. God has to bring the sinner to the point where they realize they are spiritually dead, totally unable to do anything good, utterly insufficient to save themselves.
But why? I mean, why drive someone to that level of despair?
To make them despair of self-help. It's not to make them despair of God's mercy, but to make them give up completely on their own ability. He references John 9, where Jesus says, he came so that they which see might be made blind. You have to come to the point where you admit you are sensibly blind, as Edwards would say, before you can be given sight. You have to know you are dead before you can be raised to life.
This all leads into the next section of the sermon, part 3, the reasons. He's not just describing what happens, he's explaining why God uses this method. This isn't divine cruelty. There's a deep theology behind it.
Right. And his first reason is that this process creates a harmony of God's attributes in the mind of the saved person. God is infinite mercy, absolutely. But he is also infinite justice and infinite majesty.
And you can't have one without the others.
Edwards argues that if God just showed mercy without first giving the sinner a profound sense of his justice, it would be a dishonor to his own glory. We'd start to think that God is soft on sin, or that holiness doesn't really matter.
We would approach him with what he calls undue boldness.
Yes, we'd treat his grace casually. We wouldn't have the proper awe and reverence for the judge who is pardoning us. So the discoveries of his amazing grace have to be accompanied by discoveries of his terrible majesty.
It also serves to highlight the very nature of grace itself.
It does. His second reason is that this process reveals grace as truly free and sovereign. You simply cannot appreciate grace as grace until you are convinced that it is completely unmerited. You can't grasp what sovereign mercy means until you understand that what you actually deserve is sovereign wrath.
The glory of the gift is seen against the backdrop of what you deserved instead.
That's it. The glory of grace, for Edwards, is its bestowal on the miserable and the needy.
And that ties directly into his third reason, the necessity of the mediator of Christ.
It's so important. God doesn't just show an abstract, absolute mercy. He shows his mercy through Christ. And a sinner will never see their desperate need for a mediator until they see their completely ruined state.
It's like, why would I need a bridge if I think I can just jump across the stream?
Perfect analogy. But when you see that it's not a stream, it's a grand canyon of sin separating you from a holy God, then you cry out for a bridge. You cry out for a mediator. God's will is that all the glory for salvation be given to his Son.
And the final reason he gives is that this whole process just increases the joy and the praise of the believer afterward.
Immensely. A rescue from danger is so much sweeter when you are standing right on the brink of the pit. The deeper your sense of the misery you were saved from, the higher your exaltation of the deliverer will be. Edwards imagines the believer thinking, how miserable should I have been for all eternity had not Christ loved me and given himself for me?
Now, Edwards being Edwards, he doesn't just leave this as an abstract theological lecture. He moves to part 4, application and warning. And this is where his pastoral heart comes out, and he gets very, very direct.
Yes, he turns to the people in the pews. And first, he speaks directly to the unconverted. He says, essentially, if you're not willing to see yourself as deserving of damnation, you're not ready for salvation. You have work to do.
He warns them about delaying, doesn't he?
Urgently. He says, man knoweth not his time. Death can come suddenly, but there's another danger besides death. It's the danger of God simply withdrawing. He quotes that chilling verse from Hosea, Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. For Edwards, the most terrifying judgment isn't hellfire. It's God just letting you have what you want and walking away.
Then he turns his attention to a different group. People who are actually feeling this conviction right now. Maybe someone listening feels that weight, that sense of sin. Edwards calls this the strivings of the Spirit.
And his warning to them is incredibly vivid. He uses the analogy of a blacksmith working with iron.
The iron analogy, right?
He says when you put a piece of iron in the fire, it gets hot, it gets soft, you can shape it. But what happens if you take it out of the fire and just let it cool down on the floor?
It becomes harder than it ever was before.
That's his warning. He says if you feel these convictions from the Spirit and you ignore them, you resist them, you let them fade away, your heart will become harder and more callous than it was before.
He even says it would have been better to have never felt them at all.
He does. He references 2 Peter chapter 2, that awful image of the dog returning to its own vomit. It's a graphic picture, but he's trying to show the extreme danger of trifling with the work of the Spirit. He says if God grants you the mercy of being awakened again later in life, the work will be much more difficult, and the terrors you feel will likely be far more dreadful.
So how does this happen? How do people lose their convictions?
He lists 3 common ways. The first is obvious. You fall back into sin. Committing a specific sin, he mentions lust, malice, revenge, has a way of grieving the Spirit and pushing him away.
The second is diversion.
Right, just getting distracted, drawn into worldly company, entertainment, or just the busyness of life in a way that pushes out the serious concerns of your soul.
And the third?
A change in circumstances.
Yeah.
Especially prosperity. You get a new job, you make more money, and suddenly the spiritual anxieties you felt don't seem so urgent anymore. The cares of this world crowd out the word.
But he doesn't end on that warning. He does offer encouragement to those who are in that state of conviction.
He does. He goes back to the book of Hosea, to chapter 6, verse 3. Then shall we know if we follow on to know the Lord. It's a call to persevere, to be diligent, to strike while the iron is hot, while the Spirit is near.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, if we had to summarize the main thesis of this whole sermon, what would it be?
I think it's that the path to the true comfort of the gospel often leads, necessarily, through the dark valley of the knowledge of your own sin and misery. The lion tears, not ultimately to destroy his chosen people, but to prepare them for his healing.
That's a great summary. So here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. What if you reframed the silence of God in your life? What if it isn't just absence, but an active, purposeful waiting? If you feel that God has returned to his place, could it be a call from him for you to acknowledge your offense and seek his face? Is it possible that the anxiety, the guilt, the spiritual unease you might be feeling is actually a severe mercy, the very first step of a divine rescue?
That is the question Edwards wants every one of us to ask.
Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking.
It was a pleasure to be here.